step into the whirlwind of Napoleon's empire with Military Memoirs from 1804 to 1814 by Raymond Aimery de Montesquiou-Fezensac, a gripping first-hand account of Europe's most iconic military campaigns. These are his words. Let's begin. Until this moment, the Third Corps, distant from the rear guard and barely harassed by the enemy's light troops, had only battled fatigue and hunger. Now it was about to face the full force of the Russian army, contending simultaneously with every form of death. This would prove whether patience and courage had ever been subjected to such trials. On November 4th, the Third Corps left Vyazma and took a position along a forest bordering the Vyazma River, which the Smolensk road crosses. The advantageous choice of this position and the steadfastness of the troops prevented the enemy from crossing the Vyazma. The Russians directed their attacks throughout the day on our right flank along the Medin road. General Berman, detached to defend that flank, held his ground until evening. 2 companies from my regiment had the honour of participating in this commendable defence. Meanwhile, the 4th and 1st Corps passed through our lines in a state of utter disorder. I was shocked to see how much they had suffered and how far their disorganisation had progressed. Only the Italian Royal Guard managed to maintain good order, while the rest appeared dejected and utterly exhausted. A massive number of isolated men marched in disarray, most without weapons. Many of them spent the night among us in the Vyazma forest. I tried to persuade them to move on without waiting for the rear guard. It was in their interest to gain a few hours' march ahead, and their presence in our ranks could impede our movements. Although their own welfare aligned with the needs of the service, fatigue or laziness rendered them deaf to reason. At dawn, the Third Corps took up arms and resumed its march. At that moment, the scattered soldiers abandoned their bivouacs to join us. Among them, the sick and wounded stayed by the fires, pleading with us not to leave them to the enemy. Without transport means, we could do nothing for them, so we had to feign deafness to their cries of despair. As for the stragglers who had deserted their banners despite being fit to fight, I ordered them driven off with rifle butts, warning that any obstruction they caused during an enemy attack would lead to immediate fire upon them. The 1st Division led the march, followed by the 2nd, both advancing with their left flank forward. This arrangement placed my regiment at the extreme rear guard. Platoons of cavalry and infantry covered our flanks. Upon leaving the forest, a vast plain allowed the enemy to extend and advance level with us. The officers and generals, steadfastly present at their posts, directed our manoeuvres. Though the enemy followed us all day without significant engagement, they attempted an attack on the rear guard that evening at the Semlevo defile. My regiment alone held off the Russian vanguard, supported by 2 cannons, buying time for the other corps to pass through. We too crossed the defile, leaving 2 companies of skirmishers to face the enemy. These rejoined us only in the middle of the night. The Third Corps then bivouacked on the opposing heights. We had barely begun to rest when the Russians fired shells at our bivouac. One struck a tree at whose base I had been sleeping. Thankfully, no one was injured, and only a brief moment of disorder arose among some companies of the 18th. I have often noticed that night bombardments cause little harm, but have a psychological effect, giving soldiers the impression of relentless enemy activity. The following day's march faced only minor interruptions when Cossacks made a futile attempt to attack our baggage train. After 3 leagues, the Third Corps halted near Postnya Dvor. The Emperor wished to proceed slowly to preserve the baggage. In vain, Marshal Ney wrote to him that no time could be wasted, that the enemy was pressing the rearguard closely, and that the Russian army was advancing rapidly on our flanks, risking interception at Smolensk or Orsha. Despite Ney's warnings, this day offered some respite from the previous hardships. We camped at the edge of a forest, which provided ample firewood for our bivouacs. The weather was fair and relatively mild for the season, inspiring hopes of reaching Smolensk, the intended end of our ordeal. The next day's march brought a sudden change in the weather, turning bitterly cold. We arrived late at Dorobou. The 1st Division positioned itself on the town's heights, while the 2nd Division stopped a quarter-league away to defend the approaches. That night was the coldest we had yet endured, with heavy snowfall and winds too strong to sustain fires. Moreover, the heathland where we camped offered little material for bivouacs. Marshal Ney planned to halt the enemy at Dorobou throughout the next day. We were still 21 leagues from Smolensk, and halfway there we needed to cross the Dnieper. Preventing congestion at this critical crossing and giving the army time to move its artillery and baggage was essential. At dawn on November 8th, the 4th and 18th Regiments, under General Joubert's command, left their bivouacs to take positions in Dorobou. Using the thick morning fog as cover, the Cossacks harassed us until we entered the town. Dorobou, situated on a hill and supported by the Dnieper, was defended by the 2nd Division as follows: 2 cannons in battery at the entrance to the lower street, supported by a detachment from the 4th Regiment. To the left, a company from the 18th Regiment guarded the Dnieper bridge. To the right, on the heights near a church, 100 men from the 4th Regiment held their position under a battalion leader's command. The remaining troops gathered in the castle courtyard on the same height, while the 1st Division stayed in reserve behind the town. Soon the enemy infantry arrived and began their assault. The Dnieper bridge fell, and the church position was overrun. General Razout, confined to the castle courtyard with the rest of the division, hesitated as usual and was nearly surrounded before finally ordering an advance. Acting quickly, I led my regiment in a charge, driving the enemy off the town's heights. The engagement was intense, with the snowy terrain forcing the entire regiment to fight as skirmishers in close quarters. Although we halted the Russian advance, the enemy soon re-entered the lower town. Fearing encirclement, General Razout ordered a retreat. I withdrew my regiment slowly, reforming platoons while maintaining resistance against the enemy. The 18th Regiment, which had supported us, followed suit. Both regiments fell back to regroup behind the 1st Division, leaving the enemy in control of the town. Marshal Ney, dissatisfied with the poor outcome of his plan, vented his frustration on General Razout, General Joubert, and everyone else. He claimed that the enemy's forces had not been strong enough to drive us out of Dorobou in such a manner, and he asked me how many enemy troops I had seen. I dared to reply that we were too close to them to count. Before deciding to leave, he ordered General de Henin to re-enter the lower town with the 93rd Regiment to recover some caissons. However, as soon as the regiment moved, Russian artillery caused disorder in its ranks, forcing it to retreat. Marshal Ney, compelled to abandon any further attempts, resumed the march towards Smolensk. Meanwhile, the deprivations we had endured since the start of the retreat grew increasingly severe. The meagre provisions we had left were nearly gone. The horses that hauled them were dying from hunger and exhaustion, and those same horses were then consumed by the soldiers. Since assuming the rearguard position, any man who strayed from the road in search of food fell into enemy hands, as their pursuit became ever more relentless. The intensifying cold further compounded our hardships and suffering. Many soldiers, weakened by exhaustion, discarded their weapons and left their ranks to march alone. They stopped wherever they found a piece of wood to burn, hoping to cook a scrap of horse meat or a bit of flour, if their comrades hadn't already stolen it. Hunger-stricken soldiers seized provisions from isolated men by force, and some even stole their clothing. Having ravaged the countryside, we were reduced to preying on one another, and this grim necessity became unavoidable. Priority had to be given to the loyal soldiers who maintained their ranks and alone bore the burden of holding off the enemy at the rear. Isolated stragglers, no longer attached to any regiment and incapable of serving any purpose, earned no pity. Consequently, the road we travelled resembled a battlefield. Those who resisted the cold and fatigue succumbed to hunger. Those fortunate enough to have some provisions were too weak to continue marching and fell into enemy hands. Some had frostbitten limbs and died stretched out on the snow. Others, falling asleep in villages, were consumed by the flames their comrades had ignited. At Dorobou, I witnessed a soldier from my regiment whose desperation had driven him to a state resembling drunkenness. Though he was near us, he failed to recognize anyone. He asked for his regiment, called out the names of soldiers from his company, and spoke to them as if they were strangers. His gait was unsteady, his gaze lost. He disappeared at the onset of the engagement, and I never saw him again. Among us were a few cantinières or soldiers' wives from regiments ahead of us. Many of these unfortunate women carried children, and despite the prevailing selfishness of that time, everyone rushed to help them. The drum major carried a child in his arms for a long time, and officers who still had horses often shared them with these poor souls. I too had a woman and her child transported for several days on a cart I still possessed. But what were such small acts of kindness against so much suffering, and how could we alleviate hardships that we ourselves endured? From Dorobou, we reached Slobnevo on the banks of the Dnieper in 2 days. The road was so slippery that poorly shod horses could barely maintain their footing. At night, we bivouacked in the snowy woods. Each regiment took turns serving as the extreme rear guard, continuously harassed by the enemy. Our progress was so slow that we nearly caught up with the First Corps directly ahead of us. The congestion at the Dnieper bridge at Slobnevo had been extreme, and the road a quarter league ahead was still littered with abandoned vehicles and caissons. On the morning of November 10th, before crossing the river, we worked to clear the bridge and burn all the abandoned vehicles. Some bottles of rum were discovered, which proved immensely helpful. My regiment, serving as the rear guard, defended the road leading to the bridge all day. The woods along this road were filled with wounded soldiers who had to be left behind and were mercilessly slaughtered by Cossacks almost in our midst. Second Lieutenant Rouchard, venturing too close to a caisson being detonated, was torn apart by the explosion. By evening the troops crossed the Dnieper and the bridge was destroyed. It was critical to halt the enemy at the river crossing, as we were only 11 leagues from Smolensk. Time was needed for the troops ahead to reach the city and prepare its defences. The Emperor did not even expect the Third Corps to arrive in Smolensk for another 4 or 5 days. So little did he understand the army's condition, particularly that of the rear guard. Marshal Ney made his arrangements to defend the crossing. The 4th Regiment was stationed along the riverbank, with the 18th Regiment positioned in the second line. The Marshal set up his headquarters to the left of the 4th Regiment in a blockhouse constructed to protect the bridge, which was well fortified. General Denain, with the 93rd Regiment, was posted in the village of Pnivo, a quarter league to the left, while the 1st Division was deployed along the Dnieper on the far right. That evening Marshal Ney walked for a long time in front of my regiment with General Joubert and me. He lamented the unfortunate consequences of the day at Dorobou. The enemy had gained a day's march, accelerated our retreat, and forced us to abandon our caissons, baggage, and wounded. All these misfortunes could have been avoided if Dorobou had been defended for 24 hours. General Joubert spoke of the troops' weakness and discouragement. The Marshal sharply retorted that the only thing required was to be ready to die, and that a glorious death was too great an honour to shy away from. As for me, I simply replied that I had left the heights of Dorobou only after receiving the order twice. On the morning of November 11th, the enemy infantry approached the opposite bank and engaged the 4th Regiment. The attack was so sudden and intense that bullets were falling among our bivouacs before the soldiers had time to take up their arms. The skirmishers advanced to the riverbank to return fire, but the nature of the terrain, thick with underbrush on the opposite side and entirely exposed on ours, made the combat grossly unequal. The 2nd Battalion entered the blockhouse, while the 1st positioned itself in a small wooded area for shelter. The exchange of gunfire continued between the Russian infantry and the battalions stationed in the blockhouse. Marshal Ney spent the entire day there, directing the soldiers' fire and even firing a few shots himself. I also took up position there, feeling it my duty to directly command the most exposed part of my regiment. Towards evening, the Russians crossed the Dnieper near the village held by the 93rd Regiment and manoeuvred to encircle it. General Dehaenin abandoned his position and retreated toward the blockhouse, earning a severe reprimand from Marshal Ney. It was, perhaps, an excessive criticism. In war, a detached officer must often make decisions without awaiting orders, which may not arrive in time. He is accused of weakness if he retreats, and of recklessness if he endangers the troops under his command. Bearing such injustice is one of the soldier's most trying duties. General Dehaenin's memory of this reprimand nearly brought disaster upon us later, as I shall recount in due course. The next day, November 12th, at 5 in the morning, the Third Corps resumed its march. I continued to defend the blockhouse until 7, then rejoined the column after setting it ablaze, as per explicit orders. This habit of burning everything in our path proved ill-advised in this instance. The fire signalled our departure to the enemy, who launched shells that caused casualties among our troops. 2 days of marching remained before reaching Smolensk, and those 2 days were as gruelling as the ones preceding them. The Cossacks relentlessly harassed us, even attempting in vain a serious attack on the 18th Regiment. On November 13th, we had to cover 7 leagues on icy roads amid the harshest cold. The wind was so fierce that it was impossible to remain stationary during halts, making rest yet another form of exhaustion. Finally, that evening, we arrived half a league from Smolensk, where we took position behind the ravines that protect its approaches. The night added to our suffering and became a fitting end to this brutal retreat. Several soldiers died of cold at the bivouac, while others suffered frostbite. At dawn, we were overjoyed to see the towers of Smolensk, which we had long regarded as the end point of our misery, where the army would rest and find the abundance of provisions it had been deprived of for so long. Yet these hopes were far from being realized. Fortune seemed to favor the Russians from every direction. On the Dwina, General Wittgenstein, having captured Polotsk on October 18th, was attempting to force the 2nd and 6th Corps onto the main road to Smolensk. The 9th Corps was departing from Smolensk to aid them. On the opposite end of the theatre of war, peace with Turkey allowed Admiral Chichagov, commanding the Moldavian army, to join forces with Tormasov's corps. The Austrians had retreated behind the Bug, and the Admiral was advancing rapidly to seize Minsk, where we had enormous depots, and to block us at the Berezina crossing. Meanwhile, the main Russian army continued operating on our flanks, cutting communications, capturing isolated corps, and preventing us from straying from the road. To the left, General Augereau's brigade, surrounded near Elnia, had surrendered. On the right, the 4th Corps, marching from Dorobou toward Vitebsk, had suffered catastrophic losses due to cold, poor roads, and enemy pursuit. Nearly all of its artillery was destroyed at the Wop crossing, and the Corps hurried back to Smolensk, arriving the same day as the 3rd Corps. It became impossible to remain in Smolensk. The enemy had to be preempted at the Berezina by uniting with the 2nd and 3rd Corps. Orders were given to continue the march, despite the severity of the season and the deplorable condition of the troops. The 3rd Corps, steadfast in fulfilling its noble role, remained assigned to the rear guard. We braced ourselves to summon fresh strength for new trials and renewed courage for impending dangers. Smolensk, like Minsk, was one of the army's major supply depots. It was assumed that the warehouses gathered there would meet the army's immediate needs, and indeed they should have sufficed. However, when disorder takes hold in an army of such magnitude, it becomes impossible to halt its spread. The administrators and various officials responsible for maintaining service order instead become agents of chaos, exacerbating the situation with every effort to resolve it. The passage of the army through Smolensk was a sad example of this. Since the city's capture, General Charpentier, the governor, and Monsieur de Villeblanche, the provincial intendant, had spared no effort to restore confidence among the inhabitants. Thanks to their care, supported by the Ninth Corps' good discipline, houses were beginning to be rebuilt, and supplies were being brought in from all directions and stored in warehouses. However, when our soldiers arrived en masse, they rushed to the gates, expecting rest and abundance in Smolensk. Napoleon, anticipating the chaos that isolated soldiers and disorganized regiments would cause, hastened to arrive with the Imperial Guard. He forbade entry to anyone and ordered the regiments to reform in the suburbs. The Guard received ample distributions of all kinds, and by the time attention was turned to the other troops, the army's disarray mirrored that of its administration, rendering any meaningful organization impossible. Abuses of all kinds went unpunished, the warehouses were broken into and looted, and, as always, resources meant to last several months were destroyed within 24 hours. Looting took place while soldiers starved. The Third Corps, the last to arrive under Smolensk's walls and still tasked with defending its approaches, was forgotten by those it had protected. While we held the enemy at bay, the other corps completed the looting of the warehouses. When I eventually entered the city with my regiment, I found nothing for them or myself. We were thus forced to continue our retreat without receiving any support. The Third Corps was reinforced with the 129th Regiment and an Illyrian regiment, which were divided between the two divisions. This reinforcement was desperately needed, as since leaving Moscow, the Third Corps' 11,000 men had been reduced to fewer than 3,000. The Württemberg division and cavalry had ceased to exist, and the artillery retained only a few cannons. With such meagre resources, we had to face the Russian vanguard. The army had already begun its march toward Orsha, leaving Marshal Ney behind to defend the city for as long as possible to delay the enemy's pursuit. I have described Smolensk earlier in this account, noting its position on the left bank of the Dnieper, with only a single suburb rising in an amphitheatre-like fashion on the right bank. The roads to St. Petersburg and Moscow crossed through this suburb, which by this point was nearly entirely burned down. A bridge over the Dnieper connected it to the city, and a strong fortified bridgehead on the right bank protected the crossing. On the morning of November 14th, the Third Corps left its positions outside Smolensk and was deployed as follows: the 2nd Division in the suburb on the right bank, the 1st Division in reserve at the bridgehead, the 4th Regiment guarding the Moscow gate, and the Illyrian Regiment guarding the St. Petersburg gate. The few houses spared by the fire were occupied. The cold was so severe that during the following night, soldiers posted at advanced positions threatened to abandon them and return to the houses. I sent capable officers to remind them of their duties, fully prepared to join them if necessary, and to establish myself at the bivouac with all my regiment's officers. It was a matter of honour, as my regiment was responsible for defending the entrance to the suburb, and any surprise could have compromised the entire division. Order was soon restored. The soldiers could not remain indifferent to the call of honour, and those who uttered complaints unworthy of their courage soon atoned for them with glorious deaths. On November 15th, my regiment found itself engaged alone in an encounter. That morning, the 2nd Division was ordered to abandon the right bank suburb, cross the city, and establish itself on the road to Vilnius, leaving the 1st Division in the front line to defend the bridgehead. The 4th Regiment, stationed at the suburb's entrance, was the furthest from the assembly point. Recalling the outposts took time, and General Razout, eager to execute his orders, began his march without waiting for me. I departed as quickly as possible to rejoin the division. Meanwhile, the enemy, finding the outer posts vacated, entered the suburb. Soldiers fleeing their pursuit sought refuge within our ranks. I hastened the march, but upon reaching the bridgehead, I found its passage completely obstructed by vehicles flooding in. It was impossible to get a single man across. The chaos intensified with each moment. The Russians positioned 2 cannons on the heights and began firing at the vehicles and my regiment. Panic reached its peak as drivers abandoned wagons shattered by cannonballs. Russian infantry and Cossacks advanced steadily. The situation grew critical. the attack had to be repelled to prevent the enemy from taking the bridgehead. However, finding myself alone in the suburb, I dared not engage without orders to withdraw. Fortunately, Marshal Ney, ever drawn by the sound of cannon fire, appeared atop the parapet and ordered me to drive the enemy entirely out of the suburb, giving time to clear the bridge. I led my regiment forward at a charge through the snow and the ruins of houses. The soldiers, proud to fight under the Marshal's gaze and before the 1st Division regiments watching from the ramparts, attacked the enemy with great enthusiasm. The Russians retreated hastily, taking their artillery with them. Their skirmishers were driven from the houses, and within moments we had regained control of the entire suburb. Marshal Ney sent word for me not to advance too far, a rare caution on his part. I regrouped my regiment behind the St. Petersburg Gate, engaging in a fierce battle with the Russians occupying the cemetery of a nearby church. They dared not venture beyond its walls. This combat lasted a long time despite the Russians' advantages in position, numbers, and artillery. Only after receiving explicit orders to withdraw did I begin a retreat, conducted in good order, bringing my regiment back to the bridgehead. All officers displayed exceptional zeal, none were injured, and I lost few soldiers. The sergeant whose rank I had restored earlier that day was struck by a bullet that might have been meant for me, falling dead at my feet. While the 1st Division defended the city, the 2nd spent November 16th cleaning their weapons and taking some rest. A detachment of 200 men, recently arrived from France, awaited us in Smolensk. I reviewed them and incorporated them into my regiment, bringing its strength to over 500 men. However, I was disheartened to see how much the young soldiers in this detachment had already suffered from the fatigue of the journey and the harshness of the season. Our supply wagons, which had gone ahead long before, awaited us in Smolensk. I ordered them to follow us, though other colonels sent theirs further ahead, managing to save a few. That evening, I received flattering praise from Marshal Ney for our performance during the previous day's engagement. I shared his commendation with the officers of my regiment, urging them to remain worthy of such recognition. I was heartened by the thought that our difficult task would soon be over, as the Emperor would likely assign fresh troops to relieve us at the rear guard. None of the officers had sustained serious injuries, and we still had 500 soldiers, a small but battle-tested group. How could one not feel admiration and confidence in these brave men who, amid such harsh trials, remained loyal to their banners and whose courage seemed to grow in the face of danger and deprivation? I felt proud of the honour they had earned and looked forward to the rest I hoped they would soon enjoy. This hopeful illusion was quickly shattered, but I cherish its memory as the last sweet sentiment I experienced during this campaign. Many injured and sick officers were confined to the hospital in Smolensk. Among them was one of my officers, whose thigh had been shattered. I immediately sent for him, determined to take him with us. His unfortunate companions were left to face the risks of fire, the collapse of walls, and the Russians' vengeance, as the Third Corps was scheduled to leave the devastated city the following day. Before departing, we were ordered to blow up the city walls and a large number of wagons that could not be taken with us. Smolensk was now little more than a heap of rubble. The doors and windows of the remaining houses were shattered, the rooms filled with corpses. Horse carcasses, stripped of all flesh by soldiers and starving inhabitants, littered the streets. I will never forget the sadness I felt wandering the deserted streets that night, illuminated by the glow of fires reflecting off the snow and contrasting strangely with the soft light of the moon. A few years earlier, I had seen this city in all its wealth and splendour, and the memory made the sight of its destruction even more painful. As we prepared to depart the next morning, several loud explosions signalled the end of Smolensk. We marched peacefully along the road to Orsha. Cannon fire echoed faintly in the distance, and we assumed it was the 9th Corps nearing the main road. How could we suspect that the enemy was already on our path, without warning from the corps ahead of us? Yet it soon became clear that the Russian army, advancing along a parallel route, had reached Krasnoi, while the French were still in Smolensk, preparing to block their escape. The Emperor, along with the Guard, the Fourth Corps, and finally the First Corps, was attacked in succession on November 15th, 16th, and 17th at Krasnoi. The Russians held the advantage, not only in numbers, but also against troops exhausted and almost entirely lacking cavalry and artillery. Nevertheless, valour triumphed over every obstacle. The Imperial Guard forced the passage and stayed near Krasnoi to support the Fourth and First Corps. Both the Viceroy and Marshal Davout indignantly rejected any proposals of capitulation. They too broke through the enemy lines, though at the cost of nearly all their artillery, baggage, and many prisoners. With no time to spare in reaching the Berezina, the Emperor was forced to abandon the Third Corps, hastening toward Orsha. During the 3 days of combat, no warning of the danger was sent to Marshal Ney. The Emperor later criticized Marshal Davout for not halting at Krasnoi to await the Third Corps. Davout claimed he had no choice. At the very least, he should have notified Marshal Ney. Perhaps communications had been cut off. Regardless, General Miloradovich refrained from pursuing the Emperor and instead concentrated his forces against the Third Corps, intending to capture it entirely. On the morning of November 18th, we departed Korytnia and advanced toward Krasnoi. Near the town, some Cossack squadrons harassed the 2nd Division, which led the march. Their presence was of little consequence. We were accustomed to such encounters, and a few musket volleys were usually enough to drive them off. Soon, however, our vanguard encountered General Ricard's division from the First Corps. It had fallen behind and had just been repelled after bravely enduring an unequal battle. The Marshal rallied the division's remnants, and under the cover of a fog that concealed our small numbers, we approached the enemy until their cannon fire forced us to halt. The Russian army, drawn up in battle formation, blocked our path. Only then did we realize we were cut off from the rest of the army, with salvation lying only in desperation. That concludes the 13th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.